guests, and importantly, the 1,400 students from our city's schools. Welcome on behalf of Newcastle's public, Catholic and independent school communities to the annual Newcastle Combined Schools ANZAC service. This is the 61st year that Newcastle's 3 school communities have come together to commemorate ANZAC Day. Since its beginning in 1954, more than 58,500 Newcastle school students have attended this service. We wish to acknowledge the following special guests: Lord Mayor of Newcastle, Councillor Newatali Helms, Ms Sharon Clayton, MP, Federal Member for Newcastle, representing Newcastle Permanent, CEO Terry Millett, and Directors Michael Slater, Ross Griffiths and Jennifer Leslie, together with the members of the executive team and sponsorship team. Di McCarthy, President of the Newcastle and Hunter Combined Schools ANZAC Service Incorporated, Mr Phil Winnie, President, Merriweather Hamilton RSL Sub-Branch, Mrs Jennifer Moody, Director of Public Schools, Newcastle Network, Mr Ray Collins, Director of Schools, Catholic Schools Office, Diocesan of Maitland, Newcastle, Mrs Erica Thomas, Head of School, Newcastle Grammar School, and Mrs Pam O'Day, Principal of St Philip's Christians College, representing Newcastle's independent schools, Mr Lambis Englezos, Amateur Historian and Advocate, Mr Royce Atkinson, representing the Fromelles Association of Australia, and members of the Newcastle ex-service community.
2016 marks the 17th year that this ceremony has been organised by a subcommittee of senior high school students rather than just adults. However, we could not have done it all on our own. We would wish to recognise the Australian Families of the Military Research and Support Foundation, community volunteers, and our teachers for their support and encouragement. We especially acknowledge the Newcastle Permanent Building Society, who has provided the essential financial support as sponsors for the past 13 years to enable this unique event to continue its proud tradition. We also recognise the Merriweather Hamilton RSL Sub-Branch, the Catholic Schools Office, Diocese of Maitland, Newcastle, St Philip's Christian College, Newcastle, Newcastle Grammar School, Bentley's Newcastle, Shaw Gibley, and numerous other supporters. The student members of this year's subcommittee are Isis Lever and Dana Simmons from Callaghan College Jasmine Campus, Sam McIntyre and Emma Boundy from Merriweather High School, Michael Ruitt and Hannah Everett from Newcastle Grammar School, Boyd William Stiles and Jordan Clarkson from St Francis Xavier's College Hamilton, Laura Davies and Samuel Bartlett from St Philip's Christian College Waratah. Our aim is to give you, our fellow students, a greater understanding of why we commemorate ANZAC Day, and also to highlight an important part of Australia's identity and military heritage. This service encourages you to remember significant events from Australia's past and how that influences the present and shapes the future.
ANZAC Day traditionally commemorates the sacrifices of members in the Australian and New Zealand Armed Forces, those who have served and those who died in all wars and peacekeeping operations. It is held on the anniversary of the landing by the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps at Gallipoli in Turkey 100 years ago, on the 25th of April, 1915. Since Australia became a nation in 1901, hundreds of thousands of Australian men and women have served our country in times of conflict, both in uniform as members of the Australian Navy, Army or Air Force, and as civilians in support roles such as the Merchant Navy or workers in factories and on farms. Members of the Australian Armed Forces have and are serving in war zones throughout the world and Australia, mainly in training and defensive roles. More than 100,000 Australians have died for their country as members of our armed forces, and many more were wounded. Some were held as prisoners of war. War veterans live amongst us in our community, even though we may not know who they are. They look just like any other Australian. Some are young, particularly those who have returned from conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, or peacekeeping operations in the Solomon Islands and East Timor.
Sadly, 2 Australian servicemen have died in both Iraq and East Timor. 41 members of the Australian Defence Force have been killed and 261 wounded in Afghanistan. The Australian Defence Force currently has approximately 2,750 members deployed to more than 14 operations, both overseas and within Australia, to protect Australia and its national interests. Of these, approximately 500 ADF personnel are protecting Australia's borders and maritime interests. Some veterans are middle-aged, such as the men and women who served during the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s to early 1970s. Others, who served in the Korean War in the 1950s, are much older. The oldest group of veterans in our community are those who served during the Second World War, between 1939 and 1945. Unfortunately, all of our World War I veterans who fought on the battlefields of Gallipoli, France, Palestine and Belgium from 1940 to 1918 are no longer with us.
In 1940, a series of political situations in Europe led to the two great sets of alliances, Britain, France and Russia, and Austria, Hungary, Germany and later the Ottoman Empire going into war. At the outbreak of the war, the Australian government declared that as Britain was at war with Germany, automatically so was Australia, as we were part of the empire.
Many of Australians responded enthusiastically, and a volunteer army of 20,000 was quickly raised. Approximately 10,000 men from the Hunter region signed up during the course of the war to fight with the 1st Australian Imperial Force to assist Britain and France fight against Germany and its allies.
The Battle of Fromelles took place on the Western Front during World War I on the 19th and 20th of July 1916. The goal was to create a military diversion by attacking the German line, thus drawing troops heading towards the Great Battle of the Somme, as well as testing the German line for weaknesses.
It was the first major conflict in Western Europe for the Australian Imperial Force and the 5th Division, under the command of General J.W. Mackay, formed in Egypt 5 months earlier. It consisted of seasoned soldiers from Gallipoli as well as fresh reinforcements, all volunteers. Many of them were Hunter men.
Private Notice Henry Lister, Merriweather. Robert Stanley Minnigan, Southmore.
Matthew Heppel, Kersley. Harold John Burke, West Maitland.
Edward Joseph Coughlin, Nathan.
George Croft, West Wallsend.
William Bruce Higgins, Gloucester. George Henry Ricker, Fitzhill.
John Cyril Wynne, Mars.
Lord Warwick, Singleton.
Charles Henry Hallcroft, Merriweather.
Private William Fraser, Merriweather.
Charles Moore, Rozelle.
30th Battalion.
Letters were the only form of communication with our loved ones back home, and we eagerly awaited their letters and parcels.
Dear Mother, and all.
Mail! Mail! Excuse me, Postie, do you have a letter for my family? Mum! Dad! A letter from Matt! Mail!
Nice news. Please be good.
Oh, Matthew, my darling son.
I've just received your letter from our camp in France. I'm relieved to hear you're all well over there. You need not put so many stamps on as long as I get your letters.
Matthew writes that a PO company boat went through the canals, and the passengers threw 60
wondering what's wrong. This is the third letter in 1 week. After our next move, my letters may come to a sudden stop. So, I will close with the best of love from your son, Matthew.
The ground was low-lying and most defensive work was temporary rather than established trenches. We severely lacked experience in trench warfare and the power of the German defence was significantly underestimated. We were outnumbered 2 to 1.
We were on low ground, and we advanced uphill in daylight towards the strongly defended Albers Ridge. The enemies held a strongly defended mound of earth called the Sugarloaf. They had machine gun nests that could shoot at us from all sides.
The general in charge of our offensive was the British General Richard Hayking, who decided that a
Surprise attack.
should be launched after 7 hours of
Bombing.
We Aussies expected Fromelles to be a walk in the park compared to Gallipoli.
The Germans occupied the church of Fromelles behind the enemy lines. The whole country was spread out before it like a map.
Our every move was being watched.
Sugarloaf protruded from the hill, machine guns ready and waiting to shower bullets over them. At 6 p.m. on the 19th of July, the battle began.
Us young Australians on the left, steadfast British battalions on the right, and the German lines lay across 400 metres of flat, boggy, no man's land, crisscrossed with drainage ditches and a small stream.
Within the first 2 hours, the Germans realised that the attack was at their verge, and the fight raged on.
As waves advanced over the trenches, we expected to see our comrades pressing ahead. Instead, we saw them falling and motionless.
The 14th and the 8th!
They breached the enemy lines.
Those lucky chaps had the narrow stretch of no man's land to cross.
We managed to hold it tight for 7 hours, but the German forces surrounded us, pressing us back.
The order to retreat was sounded, and our soldiers fought their way back to our trenches all through the night.
Us blokes in the 30th Battalion were carrying supplies and ammunitions to the other lads. Eventually, the situation deteriorated, and we were pulled into the front line fighting too.
Staggering scores of German machine guns fluttered violently. Dramatic noise in the cannonade. The enemy's thick with bullets swishing in a flight crisscross the lattice of death.
Hundreds were mown down. It was nothing more or less than hell.
By 8 a.m. the next morning, there were over 2,000 dead soldiers. A mournful sound of horns filled the air. This was the enemy's call for stretcher bearers.
We began clearing the trenches. The full process took 3 days.
The Germans collected the bodies as quickly as they could and buried them in a mass pit behind the enemy lines to prevent the spread of disease. They took the soldiers' name tags and gave them back to us to pass on to their families.
At this point, our General Mackay was offered a small ceasefire to enable collection of the dead bodies from no man's land. But Mackay declined, and numerous lives were lost.
Sergeant Simon Fraser returned amongst the dead to answer his comrade's plea.
Don't forget me, Connor.
The Battle of Fromelles was the bloodiest night in Australian military history, with over 7,000 British and Australian casualties.
By the end of the fight, Gallipoli was considered a picnic compared to Fromelles. 1,335 Australian men were never found nor identified.